The paper discusses user tracking using client certificates over TLS. Lucas Foppe was actually the lead researcher on this, but he couldn't make it today, so I'll be presenting on his behalf. Is that better? All right, so the normal use case for certificates in TLS is when the server's trying to prove to the client that it is who we say it is. So the client says hello, the server sends back an identity via its certificate, and they can negotiate an encrypted comms after that and send their data across. But how does a client actually do this? Well, it's very similar. Normally, though, we send a password, but sometimes this just isn't practical or we want to try something else. Luckily, TLS offers another solution via client certificates, and we're going to walk through how that has a large implication in privacy and tracking. Previously, this wasn't a wide-studied topic via the rare use case for client certificate authentication, but we see with digital ID programs with Estonia, Finland, chip cards for corporate PINs, as well as IoT devices and 802.1x EAP authentication. So the problem with client certificates, where we don't see this in the server side, is that public information is transmitted containing private identity information such as your email address, your user, and unique serial IDs. This is a problem, obviously, if you're able to collect this at a wide scale. This has previously been documented in several papers, and we'll talk about those use cases and our extensions on them. As we discussed, previously we thought about client certificate usage as a rare case, but one widely reviewed discussion is the Apple push notification system, where all Apple devices, iCloud, iTunes, are actually using client certificates to talk to the Apple push notification servers, and those contain a unique serial number. A previous paper by Walks and his team discussed how these were being transmitted in the clear. So we'll talk about that previous use case, their mitigation strategy to make sure these client certificates were no longer passed in the clear. And then we'll talk about 3 of our attacks that break that mitigation strategy that Apple employed. So we'll start off with that discussion here, where we look at the old issue where a passive attack was employed by Walks. Here we see the version 2 layer extension by Apple Push Notification Server in their client hello. The server responds with the client request and its certificate all in the clear. And then you see the client certificate sent in the clear. Walks and his team showed that with 1.5 or so points of presence on the internet, they could intercept the majority of this push notification traffic. So they later worked with Apple to mitigate this, and as you'll see, they simply changed the extension to version 3, in which the server responds with the certificate, but no longer a client certificate message. So they began their encrypted comms setup, and then you'll see the client request and the follow-on client certificate are now encrypted and no longer available for passive retrieval. So now we're going to talk about how we inspected this, read through their paper, and found a few flaws in this system. All right, so the first one is actually a downgrade of their new extension. You see the client sends a version 3 extension message. We simply flip 1 bit and change that to version 2 when we're an in-path attacker, where we're able to both receive the frame and modify it. So we just change that frame, push the downgrade attack to the server. It goes back to its previous, prior to the mitigation setup, sends the certificate of the server, still sends that client request, and we get that client certificate back. The next attack is actually a replay attack. This is useful where maybe we only see one side of the traffic. The client hello goes to the server, but we see that server response, and when that certificate comes back, we just add the certificate request back to that message stream, and we get that certificate back from the client. So 2 methods there, using an in-path attack to get the client to still respond with the client certificate. Our next attack is an on-path attack. In this case, we are only able to observe the traffic and not modify it. So we actually we're in a race condition here where we need to replay something, spoof the server before the server gets its actual valid response to the client. It's a little more difficult. This is because the default response from the server is a server certificate that uses elliptic curve, which has a signature to mitigate replay attacks like this. So the first thing we do is we actually set up a client hello where we've removed all of the all the elliptic curve cipher suites and extensions, and some other tweaks in there to force the server to respond back with a certificate that's using RSA. So that's stage one. We do this offline, have this pre-stage. Now in stage two, when we observe but can't change client hello using the mitigated strategy version 3, we then just replay all of the information that the server should be responding with, but we use that RSA-based certificate and certificate request in which we elicit a response back from the client, and we get that client certificate. All right, so those were all iOS Apple-specific attacks that we used for this methodology. However, the last two are actually applicable to TLS CCA as a whole. We actually took a look at some of the other implementations. Back in 2014, there was a paper looking at Estonia's use of websites with client certification, authentication over TLS. And they found that a third of the websites were still vulnerable to this passive attack, where all they had to do was listen to the traffic, extract the certificate, and they had the email addresses in there, a lot of user-based information. That was bad. So the first thing we did is go look at those same sites and see if there was an improvement. There was actually a decrease, and more of those websites had actually went and reverted back to using setting everything in the clear. So even though there was a mitigation strategy proposed in that paper to turn on a few server tweaks there, to at least move it so that the public disclosure of that information wasn't in the clear, people weren't using that mitigation strategy. Furthermore, the two attacks that I mentioned that weren't specific to Apple still work against the servers that are properly using that mitigation strategy. Finally, we discussed why this is a very difficult problem to address in a broad sense. Apple is able to deal with this because they own the entire ecosystem. They own the server side and they own the client side. They can push that entire request system up to the application layer, in which they were able to mitigate it after we disclosed it. This doesn't work when there's browsers and servers that aren't owned by the same entity. TLS 1.3 was just recently adopted. However, it's not widely implemented. And even when it is, if they allow for downgrades to TLS 1.2, our attacks will still work. Just quick highlights of the resolution, our responsible disclosure. We worked with Apple. We gave them all our results and worked to help mitigate the solution. They sent out a patch, and you can see they no longer are vulnerable to this attack after these upgrades. Any questions? Thank you.
Any questions?
Does the attack work on GCM, Google Cloud Messaging?
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear you.
Does the attack work on Google Cloud Messaging?
GCM?
Yeah.
We attempted to use this attack against them, but they did not respond with a client certificate.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Okay. Sorry. The third. So I was a little confused as to why the first two attacks were Apple specific. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Sure. So the first two and the diagrams are Apple specific because we attacked their servers here. So the first one only works against Apple due to the fact that we're downgrading their version system where they switch to version 3. They tell the server, hey, we're expecting that the client request is coming after we negotiate the encryption. So that only works because that is an Apple extension that's being utilized. So that's definitely only used for Apple. The next two are actually employable against all CCA.
I'm not a TLS expert, so pardon me if this is stupid, but there are a lot of other implementations. Do you have any sense what fraction of the different implementations of TLS are vulnerable? And did you just find, because you focused on Apple, did you just find the one bad one?
So this is a flaw for all TLS 1.2 and down, and once 1.3 is available, if they still allow downgrade, it'll be a TLS wide, but it's a client certificate problem. So Apple is the most widely seen ecosystem utilizing it. We observed IoT devices using this as well, which would be vulnerable. The digital ID cards, where you're authenticating to like a government website with your digital ID, similar to Estonia's digital ID cards, they were all susceptible as well. The biggest use case and the premise for our original attacks was just specifically Apple. So anyone that's using client certificates, the passive attack, if they're not actually waiting until after encryption is established, is a widely available and known discussion. We just started there and then looked at the mitigation tools that are being used there and found that we can break all those mitigation. Great question, thank you.
It's probably a stupid question, but because I didn't understand something, but so all of these attacks presume that you're sitting between the client and the server, right?
Yes, so you're either in path or on the path, so you're actually
Right.
able to either see and modify or just observe.
If the impact is user tracking and you're actually sitting between the client and the server, don't you already know who the client is? What is the, like, don't you have bigger issues than this if you actually are under this assumption?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
The impact of the attack is user tracking,
Yep.
right? But if you're sitting on the network and you know who people are,
Okay, yes. So an example would be you have your nation state actor and you're not an ISP and you're just one of these routers that are in between one of the actual servers conducting the authentication. You have really no knowledge of, just because it's sitting behind some IP or NAT, who the clients are behind there. So this can actually be done on backbone networks. That's a great question. Thank you.
I also, in line with everyone else, don't know a lot about certificates, but why do they need to contain PII? Like, is it necessary?
Yeah, so not all of them contain usernames, email addresses, but largely the digital ID folks keep that information there. So Apple, there's no PII in there, but there's a unique serial number. So at any point you were able to associate that to somebody you cared about, that serial number will be the same every time. So let's say you're in a Wi-Fi cafe and you're actually know that the MAC address is who you care about, possibly, and then anytime you're on an ISP now and you see that serial number that you correlated to the unique device, you can track it across the network. Is that? Thank you.